Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has delivered a speech in Romania's Băltusnad, a majority ethnic Hungarian town. In his address, he made claims such as calling Russian leadership hyper-rational and criticising Poland for allegedly hypocritical policies. To discuss the significance of these claims and what they mean for the Central Eastern European region, we're joined by Dorka Takácsy, a researcher at the Centre for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy. Welcome, Ms. Takácsy.
Good evening.
So before we get started, there's a short video that I'd like to share with you and our audience, and I'll take your view on that afterwards.
Since we are talking about our Polish brothers, let us mention quietly, especially now, that they have kicked our backside enough that we can allow ourselves to say a few blunt, honest, brotherly words. So the Poles are practicing the most hypocritical and sanctimonious politics of all of Europe. They morally lecture us, criticize us for our economic relations with the Russians, and meanwhile, they unashamedly do business with the Russians and buy oil through intermediaries running the Polish economy with it.
Okay, so Dorka, first of all, your view on the whole quote.
So, first of all, I think it's very important to know what is this event where this speech was delivered. So eventually, this is called like a university. Basically, this is a yearly gathering, an annual meeting of Fidesz supporters. So eventually, most of the time, high class and the leading figures of Fidesz and these surrounding circles talk to their core supporters and core Fidesz members. Obviously, especially in the recent years, it receives an increased media attention from all over the world, especially because highly divisive claims are made there and put out there. For instance, let's think back that a couple of years ago, Viktor Orban announced for the first time publicly that he tends to build an illiberal democracy in Hungary. That was the first time he publicly announced these words. So eventually, this event, I think, is mostly used for making these highly divisive claims, simply because he knows that he is going to receive an increased media attention for it. Therefore, he can use it as basically a playing field.
So who's he playing? Who's the audience he's playing to?
The most hardcore audience he has. So it's very important to see who takes part in this meeting. Most of the time, this is ministry workers and all over members of Fidesz and so on. So eventually he's playing to a friendly audience, probably the friendliest audience you can hear. So for instance, during this yearly speech he had here, he drafted a vision yet again. Most of the time he likes to use these visions, but not to present any plans. So he likes to talk about the visions simply because there you have to enlist and list a lot less concrete claims and a lot less concrete expectations regards the future. And this is the place apparently where he feels the most comfortable to draft these overarching visions, these long-term visions. So for instance, the vision that he painted now was until 2050. Can we imagine that? That sounds just irrationally long time.
Right, okay, so that's all well and good when he's preaching to a friendly audience, but these are fairly strong words to use against Poland, hypocritical, sanctimonious politics and so on. How do you think the Polish government should take that?
Well, if I were the Polish government, which I'm not, I think probably I would treat it as it is. So this speech was intended to be divisive. This speech was intended to call attention, probably all the possible attention it can get. And therefore, probably I would not overreact because this is exactly the goal of the speaker, to get overly emotional reactions. However, for instance, we have already received official responses, for instance, from the ambassador of the United States to Hungary, who also called out on these words, because it was not only Poland which received this fairly unfair criticism from the government, but also the United States, based on all kinds of weird pro-Russian conspiracy theories. So altogether, I would take it as it is.
Okay, but I mean, that may be the rational, logical kind of response, but the fact is that it is going to make a difference to the relationship, is it not, between, let's start with Hungary, Poland, and then we'll zoom out to more international relationships.
Indeed, it would, and it should, because, for instance, during the speech, there were certain misinformation also voiced. So, for instance, Prime Minister Orban talked about how Poland has basically turned away from the Visegrad Four and kind of left it in favor of creating this other axis. So, basically, this was a very, in a way, mysterious speech, somewhat overarching, somewhat mysterious. But the way how he kind of talked about this is actually, of course, beyond the norms that we usually see. So, for instance, to suggest that Warsaw has left the Visegrad Four, which it did not, given the fact that, for instance, especially these times, to my best knowledge, Poland is the president of the Visegrad Four. But Viktor Orban, in his speech, suggested that Poland has left it just to be in favor of another axis, which consists of London, Kiev, the Baltic states, and the Scandinavian states. It suggests that basically he's talking in very abstract terms, rather far from reality.
Right. So you mentioned the Visegrad Four, the V4, four countries, of course, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland. Now, at a recent meeting, there was a very clear split, was there not, with Hungary and Slovakia on one side, Robert Fico from Slovakia, and Poland, Czech Republic on the other. And the split was based on Slovakia and Hungary's attitude, policies towards Russia. So is it Poland that's left the V4, or is it the other way around?
Well, this is clearly an issue where apparently there is no reason to find any compromise. So apparently, for instance, Hungary's highly pro-Russia foreign policy and Slovakia's rhetorically increasing affiliation in this regard are definitely a keystone or a milestone, so to say, with which one we cannot really do much. So apparently, as long as these countries, Russia policies and their affiliation to Russia does not change, apparently there is little room for the V4 to develop together, and probably this is better so.
So what does that mean for the V4 generally? I mean, you know, it seems as though there's no overlap, there's no room for conversation and moving forward as a group. How do you see that proceeding?
Well, at the moment, I see that clearly all the meaningful domains are somewhat behind some obstacles. Which obstacle is created by this differing affiliations to Russia? However, Visegrad is not entirely that, so to say. So, for instance, all the cultural programs, educational programs, and these kinds of programs are ongoing. However, yes, it is visible that the limits are there, and the limits are palpable. However, we have to remember ourselves sometimes that it is not probably the first time or the first period for the Visegrad Four when it is seemingly inactive. However, at certain level it still exists, and at the very moment when there will be another chance for the V4 countries to unite their forces in order to reach a certain common goal, yet again, it is going to be possible. So the Visegrad Four has already seen such periods when it was fairly inactive, yet it was able to regain its strength and to act once again. So once this occasion will occur, probably it's going to be possible again.
So you're quite optimistic in terms of the long-term future, but I mean, surely Putin sees Hungary and Slovakia as useful allies in the heart of the European Union, causing division, causing delays in support for Ukraine and so on. He's not going to let that go easily, is he?
Indeed. Eventually, the Hungarian government's and deeds and rhetorics, and increasingly the Slovakian parliaments and president's rhetorics, are increasingly useful. They are tremendously useful in the Kremlin's hands. If we look at the Kremlin's media and propaganda empire, they excel at using these words in their favor. So, for instance, every single time when Prime Minister Orban pronounces harsh criticisms towards the West, towards the EU, towards Washington, towards Brussels, all these words are things which the Kremlin's propagandists simply feast on, and they exploit it to the fullest.
So I'd like to explore that. How then would you characterize the relationship between the Kremlin and Orban?
Probably transactional, I would say. So this is something how the Hungarian government also describes its own deeds. This is not necessarily so. So what we see regarding the Hungarian governments and the Hungarian foreign policy in general, it claims itself to be transactional. It is only selectively so. So it is transactional towards certain countries, looking at Russia, looking at China, looking at other illiberal and autocratic countries all across. However, it is very strongly ideological, for instance, or it has a strong ideological load. Let's think back, for instance, when Hungary was delaying tremendously Sweden's NATO accession. There, the reasons listed why this delay was necessary from Hungary's side were clearly and exclusively ideological. So, however, the Hungarian government claims our foreign policy to be transactional, it is only selectively so. But with regards to Russia, it is predominantly a transactional foreign policy, even though sometimes the interests, especially the national interests, are not always clear and definitely not always public.
Right, okay, you say they're transactional, but, stopping aid to Ukraine, for example, has a real world, real life and life and death impact. And yet Hungary has done that time and time again when the EU has tried to send aid, military aid in particular. What's behind that?
On the one hand, I believe that there is this conviction that the government has, and it also is present in its rhetorics. Probably the government does not believe that Ukraine is going to win this war, therefore positions itself already for the aftermath of that. However, there is little rational if we look at Hungary's own national interest beyond all these deeds.
Right, okay. Well, it seems to be playing rather well into the hands of the Kremlin. Now, in terms of the rest of the European Union, I mean, Hungary has kind of slid into the role of the black sheep in the EU for a number of reasons over a number of years. How do you see that relationship progressing? Is there anything else the EU can do?
Well, and there is a lot of work in becoming that black sheep, so it didn't happen overnight. Like building up this black sheep image also required tremendous work. So at the moment, I see that the relations between the EU and Hungary are not rosy, to say the least. And apparently, we have seen that, for instance, the last week's so-called peace mission, meaning these interesting travel destinations that Orban chose to himself, also parading as the EU's rotational president. However, he did not receive any mandate from the EU at all. Eventually, these can be understood as a kind of troll diplomacy in a way. So eventually Hungary and the Hungarian leadership plays itself into this role of the black sheep actively. So it did not just happen to the government, but eventually they just like to be this l'enfant terrible, the terrible child, simply because probably there is the understanding that this terrible child, so-called, can have a bigger room for maneuver, or at least this might be the underlying calculus.
Well, we shall be seeing. Thank you very much for your analysis, sharing it with our audience. Do come and see us again, Dorka Takácsy. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.